I still couldn't believe that Robbie had left me without a word. I was so angry and devastated that he left without saying a word to me after 24 years of marriage. How could he do that to me? And yet, everyone told me that I should cut him loose and move on with my life. I know they are right, but it is still very hard for me to do so. In an attempt to move on with my life, I decided to reorganize the basement. It was Robbie's sanctuary when he wanted to be alone and play guitar. I thought all his stuff was gone, but then I found one box in the corner next to a bookshelf. Besides his school stuff, there were about a dozen notebooks in there. Apparently, he had kept several diaries over the years. Then I noticed a 3-ring binder where Robbie seemed to have collected all the scattered bits and pieces of different diaries into one place. The sight of Robbie's diary brought on a new surge of sadness, anger, and more tears over him leaving me. Finally, pulling myself together, I wiped the tears from my cheeks and carried the folder upstairs to the living room. Settling down on the couch with my heart still completely broken, I began to read. Robbie Wilder's diary. I learned to play guitar when I was 4 years old. My grandfather, Seth Wilder, taught me and bought me my first guitar when I was 6. From then on, I felt like I had the guitar in my hands almost all the time. My grandfather also taught me to love country music. In fact, he taught me to appreciate all other kinds of music. Well, that's not really true. He had a hard time teaching me to appreciate rap. And I have to admit that I still haven't found a single rap song that stirs my soul. I find it kind of crude and raw. But I guess that's why they say, different strokes for different people. On the other hand, there's something about country music that really gets under my skin. I'm not saying I like all country music, but I find a lot more of what I like than what I don't like. I especially like many of the stars from the 50s through the 70s. Performers like George Jones, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, Loretta Lynn, Kenny Rogers, and especially Patsy Cline. I love just about everything these performers did. When I turned 12, my parents, Jason and Hannah, let my grandfather take me on weekend tours of churches within a 50-mile radius. Grandpa was part of a trio that played and sang gospel in a dozen or more churches once a month on a rotating basis. The group performed at 2 or 3 churches in a weekend. They were popular, and church attendance always increased when they knew Grandpa and his band would be there. I remember my dad's last words to me before we hit the road that first time. He knew how nervous I was. Robbie, just let the music flow from your soul and you'll do great. And every day since then, when I play or sing, I try to let people feel how much music means to me. I can play guitar better than anyone, but I think my voice is mediocre. My grandfather never agreed with my assessment, but then he always thought everything I do is great. However, I can project a power in my songs that most singers can't. And over the years, I've developed the ability to instantly connect with an audience. Still, on that first trip, I was very nervous when we pulled up to the first church. I say church, but it was really just a huge chapel. It could fit about 40 people in it. However, I saw about 200 more folding chairs set up under the trees in front and to the side of the church. I also noticed speakers hanging from both sides of the church and from several trees. My stomach felt like it was jelly as I followed my grandfather down the aisle. My grandfather played acoustic guitar, Bert Zimmer played bass guitar, and Willie Stanton played banjo or fiddle. I usually played acoustic guitar, but I could also play bass or banjo. I wasn't as good as Bert or Willie, but I was damn close to it. And in 2 years, I would surpass them. The church was very beautiful, with pews that had hand carvings on each end. Windows with stained glass windows in bright colors were visible everywhere. The altar was made of mahogany, with an elaborate cross carved in the center with angels at the corners. The huge crucifix hanging behind the altar was hand-carved. The expression carved on Christ's face made you almost feel his pain. The pastor began the service, but I noticed it was abbreviated. We sang 2 hymns to complement his service, with me playing the banjo. After we started the first song, I relaxed a bit. All I had to do was play my instrument. However, after the church service was over, we got down to the actual performance. And I knew I had to sing a duet with my grandfather on the song, Just a Closer Walk with Thee. When we got to that number, I started to get really nervous again. But my grandpa was so good with the church congregation that I thought they would clap, even if I squealed like a hawk. In any case, the numbers preceding my duet went well, and the parishioners were quite appreciative. When I got up to sing my duet, I was still very nervous. but my grandfather's smile immediately put me at ease. When we finished, the parishioners cheered us on. It was the first time anyone outside of my family applauded my music. It was an elation like I had never experienced before. I was hooked. The pastor was very pleased. He said it was the largest audience his church had ever had. The donations made that day would help lead the church out of the crisis. The only money my grandfather's group ever took was a few dollars for gas and food if the women of the church didn't make anything. Before we left, the pastor asked for a date when my grandfather and his group would return. It was decided that we would return in 2 months. My grandfather liked to give an equal chance to every church that wanted to host his group. The next church was an hour away, and it was one of those mega churches. You know, the kind with thousands of parishioners. They had their own band that performed on Sundays, but today the band members were just going to be spectators. The church was more like an auditorium set up for a rock concert. The entire auditorium was set up to maximize the acoustics. Even the crucifix, made of metal, stood at an angle so as not to interfere with the sounds coming from the altar. The windows, though covered in glass, looked more like works of modern art. As nervous as I was at the first performance, I was terrified at this one. There would be several thousand spectators in the audience, including standing room only. The other church was small and intimate, but this one was just huge and intimidating. The sound system was amazing. It would put many recording studios to shame. What was even more intimidating was that I was supposed to do the solo from Amazing Grace. I was sure I was going to screw up big time. My stomach was churning with excitement. It didn't help that when we stopped for lunch, I had eaten a double cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate shake. Now my stomach wasn't feeling good. I had terrible gas pains, but I didn't know what to do. However, I knew that no matter what, I had to keep going. With all my determination, I squeezed my ass tightly and tried to stand. I was given a small stool to sit on and placed a microphone right in front of me. The band had just started their first song when I couldn't hold back my gasps any longer. I let out this ear-pounding fart. And because the microphone was positioned in such a way that amplified my stomach explosion. The band stopped playing and looked at me. There was silence in the church and my face turned 16 different shades of red. I did the only thing that came to my mind. I leaned into the microphone and said, "The devil made me do it." The congregation erupted into a roar, and I saw my grandfather and his buddies splinter. When things began to calm down, my grandfather looked at me and said, "Don't you have something else to say?" Grinning, I leaned back into the microphone again. "With God's grace and forgiveness, I won't do it again." The congregation erupted into roars again. My grandfather only grinned and started playing again. I never got nervous in front of an audience after that. Before I knew it, it was time for my solo. Even with what I thought was an average voice, I intended to put all my energy into this song. So I put all my energy into performing Amazing Grace. By the time the last notes faded, the congregation was up and cheering. The rest of the concert was a huge success. On the way home, I was teased at length about my stomach misadventures, but after dropping Bert and Willie off, my grandfather got serious. "Robbie, you had a great day today," he said proudly. "But I hope you don't allow yourself too much. I pray you never have the desire to become a famous singer. I've seen thousands of people chasing that dream. And many of them are much better than you, but almost all of them end up bitterly disappointed. Millions of people chase the same dream every year, and only a few succeed. Just love music for its beauty and you will never be disappointed." Between my dad and grandfather, the foundation of my philosophy on music and performing was born. I loved to play even if no one was around, but I felt doubly blessed if there was someone to share my music with. And I continued to perform with my grandfather for another 3 years. However, then the band started to break up. First, Bert had a stroke and couldn't play anymore, and then Willie died of a sudden heart attack. In the end, it was just me and my grandfather. But a few more months went by and it was over. Grandpa's heart no longer lay toward it. Besides, I was in high school and discovered girls. Actually, I had discovered girls much earlier. But I never understood how the female mind works, and I don't think any guy ever will. Maybe it's my poor choices, but every time I've tried to get involved with a girl or woman, I've ended up on the losing end. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a crush on Rebecca Simons. She was a petite, blonde-haired girl who I thought was the most beautiful girl in the world. We became friends, And then she told me that if I gave her my special rock, she would be my girlfriend. It was actually just a crystal my mom bought me. But when the sun shone on it at a certain angle, it shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow. However, 3 days later, Rebecca gave my rock to Jimmy Wheeler to be her boyfriend. When I asked Rebecca about my special stone, she only laughed at me. I never got it back. In 7th grade, Annie Adams convinced me that she would show me hers if I showed her mine. Being naturally curious, I readily agreed. Unfortunately, we got caught. It all went downhill, especially when Annie claimed it was my idea. And then, as now, they believed the girl. I was spanked for life, but I took comfort in seeing Annie. Still, I didn't understand why Annie had turned her back on me. When I asked her about it, she just smirked. Over the years, I'd grown suspicious of girls, so by junior year, I'd only had a dozen or so dates. I wasn't a bad guy, but I wasn't handsome. Then I met Sally Bertrand. She was only a sophomore, but very pretty. I had 3 dates with her before I asked her to prom. She was thrilled, and so was I. I ordered a tuxedo and bought tickets. 2 days before prom, Sally told me that her parents were making her go with Craig Wilkes. I knew that was bullshit. Craig was the captain of the basketball team and a junior who was supposed to be a senior. I had no doubt in my mind that she was switching places. I was crushed, but there was no way I was going to let Sally know about it. It was because of some advice my grandfather gave me. Shortly before my grandfather decided to stop performing, he asked me if I had a girlfriend. When I replied that I didn't, he chuckled and said that I should. He then explained that when I decided to date girls, there was a good chance that one or more of them would break my heart. And if that happens, he told me to never let a woman know that it bothers me and never beg her to come back. And most importantly, he told me that if someone breaks my heart, only time, distance, or another woman can fix it. So when Sally broke the news to me, I told her that it was no big deal. I would just ask someone else. I could tell by the look on her face that she was offended by my response. That alone gave me a little satisfaction. I immediately went and asked one of Sally's friends if she wanted to go to the prom with me. I actually asked her best friend, Carol Adamson, who wasn't as pretty as Sally but still cute. She was thrilled. Really, it wasn't a problem for her. For a sophomore to get a prom invitation from a senior was an instant status boost. Prom was pretty boring. I did a lot of dancing with Carol, but she was really annoying. Almost every sentence out of her mouth ended with, "Well, you know." However, the evening did not go to waste. Craig managed to get drunk on whiskey that someone had smuggled into the dance. I found out later that he threw up on Sally while they were kissing. Karma can be a bitch, of course. I did a year of community college, but it wasn't for me. Even though I was in the music department, I felt like my professors didn't really understand music. They talked a lot about theory, but they had no soul. So I dropped out and got a job in a music store where I met and married Susie Carlucci. She was a flashy Italian woman from a big family. She pursued me until I fell hopelessly in love with her. For the next 6 months we dated, and I was thrilled when she agreed to marry me. Even though her mother and father hated me, her brothers thought I was cool. They often came to the clubs where I performed. And I liked working at the record store, but it certainly wasn't the highest paying job. Even combining my regular salary with what I made teaching people to play different instruments, I only brought in about $30,000 a year. However, on average I was making about $100 a week playing in various bars and cafes. In total, I was making a little over $35,000 a year. That was more than a lot of people made in Tifton, Georgia. Susie and I had been married for 3 years, and I thought everything was wonderful. I loved her to death, thought she loved me. But one day I came home, and Susie was sitting in the living room of our rented house with her suitcase by her side. "What's going on?" I asked. "I'm sorry, Robbie, but I'm leaving you," she said, looking at herself in the compact mirror. Grandpa's advice immediately worked. Not that no one cares, but is there a specific reason? "As soon as we get divorced, I'm going to marry George Menard," Susie said, looking at me contemptuously. "You have no ambition, and I want much more than you can give me." "Are you talking about that fat bastard who owns the car dealerships?" said I with a nasty smile. "You've been having fun with him?" Susie laughed. That laugh and the smirk on her face made me furious. Fortunately, I didn't lash out at my wife. However, I grabbed Susie and carried her to the front door, swung it open and threw her onto the front lawn. I then threw her suitcase next to her. I then called her parents and told them where they could pick up the trash. When Susie's father answered the phone, I growled into the receiver. "Albert, your whore daughter has been having fun with George Menard. I just threw her out on the front lawn. Pick her up before the garbage men pick her up." Yes, Menard got her pregnant. Of course, I made it all up. I didn't know anything about Susie's pregnancy at the time. I just put that phrase in because I knew the Carluccis were big Catholics and something like that would have been out of place. As it turned out, Susie was indeed pregnant. Nevertheless, the Carlucci family took her back, but they never really caught on to George. But it didn't matter. My heart was broken, and worse, there was nothing I could do about it. When people are wrong about you and you sit back and accept it is the worst feeling in the world. Oh, I got a little revenge because my next call was to Mrs. Menard to tell her what her husband and my wife were up to. Apparently, Susie was a bit quick to answer. Good old George was trying to hide a lot of money before handing his wife the divorce papers. Warned of this, Mrs. Menard, Carol, had swooped in on Mr. Menard with a whole horde of lawyers. She didn't take him out, but she got her pound of flesh from him. I learned this from my attorney during the divorce. However, that little piece of information did nothing to assuage my feelings. I was devastated by Susie's betrayal, and my soul was broken. But I didn't want anyone to know how much I was hurting, so I had to continue. Okay, I admit that I got drunk that night, but the next day I went to my parents and sobered up. I told them about what Susie had done, except for the pregnancy, which I didn't know about at the time. Instead, I said that Susie and I had become more like roommates. I don't know if they believed me, but they were very supportive. Susie had stabbed me in the back, and calling Mrs. Menard and Susie's parents was the only revenge I could get. It was pure agony for me to see Susie driving around in her new BMW convertible, sometimes with George and sometimes by herself. And Susie decided she was going to get revenge on me for throwing her out on the front lawn. She dragged George to some of my shows and made fun of me. At first, I tried to ignore them, but eventually I got fed up, and one night I lashed out at them with words. I think I crossed the line when I asked Susie if she knew who the father of her unborn child was and whether he was white or black. That made them go away, but in the end, Susie still won because I got fired. The bar owner also refused to pay me for the night. Every day the situation got worse. Still, I didn't want anyone to know how much I was hurting. On Monday, after I literally kicked Susie out, I went back to work at the music store. Around noon, Susie's 3 brothers showed up, and I realized I was about to get the beating of my life. When I saw them come in the front door, I put brass knuckles on my right hand. They were probably going to beat the crap out of me, but I was going to set 1 or 2 of them up. But they didn't do anything. "Robbie, can we talk to you?" asked Frankie, the oldest, as they came in. I knew there was nowhere to run, so I nodded. "Look, we just want you to know that we don't hold a grudge against anyone," Frankie said, shuffling awkwardly in front of the cash register. "I mean, I wish you hadn't dumped her on the front lawn, considering she's pregnant, but we all understand. You were justified." Now I felt guilty for pouncing on Susie. Even though it wasn't my baby, I would feel terrible if anything happened to it. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But I didn't know Susie was pregnant." "You told our father she was pregnant," Sal, the youngest, objected. "I know I accused her of it, but I didn't really know," I replied. "I was just messing with your father's head." The 3 brothers started giggling. Then Frankie spoke up. "I wish I could have been present when Susie landed on her ass. That would have been priceless. Susie and Mom were screaming at us to beat the shit out of you. Daddy told them to shut their holes. He said you had every right to do what you did and more." "Really?" I was totally surprised that Susie's dad was standing up for me. "I thought he hated me?" "Oh, he still hates you," Frankie confirmed. "It's just that he's an old-fashioned Italian and can't stand cheating wives. Susie's caught his wrath and backlash for saying barbs to him 2 or 3 times now." I was happy that Susie's brothers were not angry with me. I liked them all very much, and I was really trying to get my life together in Tifton. But then my grandfather started to decline. He was put in a nursing home a month or 2 before Susie and I broke up. His mind began to weaken, and that made me very sad. Of course, I visited him as often as I could, and I told him the whole story of Susie and me breaking up. That day he was more or less in agreement with it. "Robbie," he said with a sad smile, "you need time, and you need to put distance between you and your ex-wife." We talked for about an hour before he got tired. Before I left, he reminded me to never chase the dream of becoming famous. He died the next day. I struggled for another 3 months, but when my grandfather died and the love of my life was now living with another man, I realized it was time to move on. My parents didn't want me to leave, but they understood why I had to. The thought of leaving Tifton was daunting. I never thought about moving anywhere else until Susie left me and my grandfather died. However, Tifton is nice in that it's only a 3.5-hour drive to Atlanta on I-75. Also, after the divorce, I had a little over $5,000 left over. It was mostly money I had been secretly saving to take Susie on a vacation to Europe. Legally, I was supposed to split it with her, but I decided screw her. I said goodbye to my folks, wagged my finger at the George Menard dealership, and hit the road. When I got to Atlanta, it only took me one day to get settled. All I could afford was a room in College Park. As it turned out, the room was in a house owned by a nice black family named Monroe. Henry and Mabel Monroe had been happily married for almost 35 years. Both were in their 50s. Tyrone and Tabor were their 2 sons. Both lived at home and paid rent. Mabel and Henry questioned whether to rent the apartment to me, since I was white. In fact, Henry even said it would be strange for him to rent to a white man. "Oh my God," I said, frantically groping my face. "Am I white?" Mabel was amused by this, and she put her hand on Henry's arm. "He'll be all right. Give him a room." It was a little strange at first, but they treated me well. And after the cruel betrayal by my wife, it was nice to see the companionship of a loving family. Henry was a mailman and Mabel worked at the daycare center. Tyrone was a mechanic and Tabor was a real estate salesman, according to him. After a while, I realized that Tabor was actually a low-level drug dealer. His parents didn't know that he was selling small amounts of marijuana, crystal methamphetamine, and ecstasy. Oddly enough, I got along best with Tabor. No, I didn't do drugs. I preferred beer. What I liked about Tabor was his friendly humor. He was very funny and made everyone laugh. Years later, I was shocked to learn that he was shot and killed one night during a drug deal gone bad. I chose College Park because MARTA, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, runs right through it. I can walk to the station and I don't have to drive into the city. Finding a parking spot is nearly impossible, and parking in downtown Atlanta costs a fortune. Once settled, I set about looking for a job. I must have applied to 40 or more different places. First, I went to every music store within a reasonable radius. None of them were hiring. Then I started with the classified ads looking for jobs. After interviewing, it turned out that either they weren't interested in me or I wasn't interested in them. After 2 weeks of unemployment, I began to despair. One afternoon, after being turned down for yet another job, I decided to stop by a bar near where I had my last interview. It was a Friday anyway, and I had no more interviews for that day. So I decided to grab a drink and a bite to eat. The exterior of this bar turned out to be very deceiving. Inside, it was much larger than it appeared from the street. I expected to be in a relatively small room with a bar counter and a few chairs and tables dotted around. However, as soon as I passed through the double doors, the room expanded on both sides. Since the lighting was dim, I couldn't see everything. Along the right side stretched a long bar counter with about a dozen customers sitting at it. There were about 80 or 90 tables on the main floor. What immediately caught my eye was the small stage at the far end of the hall. From the doorway, I could see instruments standing on several stools in the center of the stage. It looked like there were live performances being held here, and that piqued my interest. But first I wanted to grab a bite to eat and a beer. I sank into a seat 3 seats away from the nearest customer and waited for someone to pay attention to me. I recognized from a used coaster on the bar that the establishment was called Big Carl's. And from the looks of it, it does indeed host live entertainment. Although there weren't many customers, there were 3 people working behind the bar. 2 of them were young men, and the other was a very attractive girl. One of the guys was about 6 feet tall with brown hair. There was a sense of femininity about him. Nevertheless, he smiled a lot and seemed pleasant enough. The other was a couple inches shorter, had black hair, and was talking to his partner about the blue streak. The girl appeared even prettier when I got a better look at her. She had dark blonde hair cut in a pageboy style. She had a button nose and a slim but cute figure. If she'd had pointed ears, I'd have mistaken her for an elf. Right now, she looked like an angry elf. Eventually, the girl walked over and threw a new coaster on the bar in front of me. "What would you like?" "Can I get something to eat?" I asked. She snorted, then sighed. "Yeah, I guess so. What do you want?" "Can I have a hamburger and freeze? I'd also like a bottle of Coors, if you have it. If not, I'll take any domestic beer." "A hamburger would take at least 20 minutes, she snapped back. "They're just about to break out the grill. Why don't you order a sandwich?" The words about the sandwich sounded more like an order than a question. I was having a bad day, and her attitude was annoying me. I didn't need to go anywhere, so screw it. I wanted a hamburger. "I can wait. I want a hamburger," I said with a smile. After she not so carefully placed the bottle of beer in front of me, she turned away with annoyance. As she walked away, I couldn't help but wonder who had pooped in her crispy cutlets this morning. I continued to watch as she left my order and headed into the back room and up the stairs, which I hadn't noticed when I walked in. The other two guys disappeared into the kitchen. I didn't know if they had some business there or if they were just trying to stay out of sight of the angry elf. Having performed in many bars, I was somewhat taken aback by her behavior. She didn't just seem agitated, she seemed completely pissed off. I had no idea what was bothering her, but I sure as hell wasn't going to put up with it if she gave me any more of her shit. I sipped my beer for a few minutes while I waited for my food, and I finally got bored. So I got up and wandered around the hall. I estimated that this place could hold a couple hundred people if there were tables and chairs. But then I saw a sign that said that seating was limited to 275. Stopping in front of the stage, I estimated that it was an elevated platform 20 by 20 feet in size. On the stage stood a bass guitar, banjo, synthesizer, and kazoo. The synthesizer wasn't a top-of-the-line model, but it still had to cost at least $1,800. Oddly, they didn't have an acoustic guitar. I would find out the reason for that in just a couple minutes. "Damn it, Carl Ty, just get up and leave." I heard the voice of a girl with brown hair. I looked up and saw a short, dense man coming down the stairs with the girl trailing behind him. The man, whose name I guessed was Carl, looked to be about 50 or 60 years old. He had thin gray hair, a pot belly, and a snub nose. The elf-like woman looked like she was ready to explode. "It's not my problem, Tanya," Carl said in an indifferent voice. "If you can't replace him in the next hour, I'll find another group. Besides, you guys aren't going to set the world on fire. But even if you can't find a replacement, I'll let you stay and work the bar until the new group gets settled in." "Shit," said Tanya, and left for the kitchen. Then I heard yelling, and all three of us went outside arguing. The point of the argument was to replace Ty with someone who plays acoustic guitar. Since I can play any guitar, I thought this was a golden opportunity. "Excuse me," I interrupted their argument, "but I couldn't help overhearing that you need an acoustic guitarist." "Of course you do," Tanya snapped back. "I can play any guitar," I said with a smile. Tanya only frowned and turned to her companions. "We need to find someone permanent, or we're going to be totally screwed." The taller of the men looked at Tanya and then at me. "Do you really know how to play guitar?" "Yes," I replied enthusiastically. "What about songs? We're mostly a cover band, leaning more towards pop and country music from the 60s and 70s. Do you know any Beatles, Johnny Mathis, Dolly Parton, John Denver, Patsy Cline, or Glenn Campbell songs?" "Yeah, I know pretty much all of their songs," I lied. I knew all the songs by the Beatles, John Denver, Dolly Parton, and Loretta Lynn. I used many of them when I performed at Tifton. However, I had little knowledge of Johnny Mathis and only knew one song, Rhinestone Cowboy, by Glenn Campbell. He wasn't one of my favorites. But when it came to Patsy Cline, I knew all of her major hits. Patsy Cline was my all-time favorite country singer. I usually ended my performances with one of her lesser-known hits, True Love. I don't know why, but Patsy Cline's rendition of this song always drew a standing ovation. As for knowing the songs, I figured anything I didn't know I could learn quickly. "Simon, we're wasting time," Tanya complained. "We need to call the talent agency and see if they can find us someone for tonight." Said That we should spend 5 or 10 minutes to see if this guy can do what he says, the guy objected, then turned to the other man. What do you say, George? Yeah, why not? George nodded. And if you don't want to listen, Tanya, you can go and see if the agency has someone for us. Okay. Tanya trailed off, and I watched as she pulled out her cell phone and started looking up information online. Hopefully this day would turn out better than I thought it would when I first walked into this bar. I headed towards the stage, but George grabbed my arm. Wait a minute. My bass guitar and Simon's banjo won't do. There's an old guitar that Ty left behind because he bought a new one. It's not very good, but we'll take it into consideration. George disappeared and returned a few minutes later with the promised guitar. It was quite old and battered. It also had dust on it, indicating that it hadn't been played in a long time. Still, beggars can't be choosers. I brushed off the dust and, taking a seat on the stage, began to tune the guitar. Once Ty's old guitar was as tuned as it could ever be, I decided that I would only sing parts of 4 or 5 songs to give them an idea of what I was capable of. I just hoped I would be good enough. I was really looking forward to this gig. I hadn't been able to perform in weeks. Besides, I had already started burning through $5,000. When I was ready, I looked at Simon and George and smiled. Hey, it's great to be here. I can't believe the size of this crowd. Sit back and let's get this show on the road. Both men laughed and George gave me a thumbs up. I started with the only Glenn Campbell song I knew, Rhinestone Cowboy. Then I moved on to Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, then Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, and finish it with Patsy Clean's True Love. When I finished, the guys were clapping and whistling. Even a few people at the bar were clapping. It was great. I looked over at Tanya. I knew she would have the last word, and I silently prayed that she would give me a chance. Part 2. I stood alone on the small stage and watched 3 people talk about me as if I wasn't there. I felt like I was back in school waiting to get a test back that I wasn't sure I had passed. Only in this case, I had just finished mini-auditioning for a small cover band that was performing at Big Carl's bar. I had been in Atlanta for 2 weeks without finding a job, and my funds were running low. I didn't know how much the job paid, but any income would help me stop the financial bleeding until I found a real job. However, despite her beauty, the group leader Tanya gave me the impression of being a total bitch. As much as I wanted to get into this band, I figured she would tell me to get the hell out. Stepping down from the stage, I watched her closely. She put her phone away and stared at me intently. The fact that she didn't snap at me I took as a good sign. But she didn't smile either. Finally, Tanya joined George and Simon. Both guys were smiling almost cheerfully, but Tanya's face was still expressionless. Finally, she smiled and held out her hand. I'm Tanya Parker. The taller one is Simon Ockbaker, and the other one is George Sanders. I put this group together and we're known as Tanya and Crew. What about you? I took her hand and replied, I'm Robbie Wilder. Well, Robbie Wilder, Tanya said, as she let go of my hand. Do you have an acoustic guitar? Do bears shit in the woods? Laughed I. Stupid question, she smiled, then turned serious. Here's the thing. We get paid $900 to sing for 3 hours on Friday and 3 hours on Saturday night. The rest of the week, we also work behind the bar. While singing, we put out a tip jar. I get $300 and you divide the rest amongst yourselves. All the tips we receive are divided into 4 parts. Your hourly pay for working at the bar, which isn't much, stays with you, as well as any tips you get from serving drinks. Would that interest you? About bears again, I said excitedly. Tanya laughed and went back behind the bar. 15 seconds later, she returned with several pages stapled together. It was a list of songs. The first 3 pages are the songs we play all the time. The rest of the pages are songs that we include periodically in the program. Familiarize yourself with them and let me know which ones you don't know. I scanned the first page and a half and knew them all. Then I found a Glenn Campbell song that was unfamiliar to me and pointed it out. Tanya pulled out her copy and marked that song. I finished the full list and found 5 more songs I didn't know. That's pretty impressive, Simon said. Ty was with us for a year, and he had 30 or 40 dozen songs he either didn't bother to learn or couldn't play. How soon can you pick up your guitar and come back here? Asked Tanya, glancing at her watch. As long as it takes Marta to drive me to College Park, pick up my guitar and get back here. Okay, I'd like to do a little warm-up practice before we go on. After they wrapped up my burger, I paid the bill and headed out the door. Luck favored me as I made my way to the MARTA station as the train had just arrived. 20 minutes later, I hopped off and ran to Monroe's house. By my calculations, it wasn't long before noon, so I had time for a quick shower and change of clothes. I returned to the station with my guitar. $200 a week wasn't enough to cover all my expenses. But with tips and what I'd get paid for working behind the bar, I figured it would be enough until I found a full-time job. When I got to the platform, I had to wait for the next train for about 10 minutes. The whole time I was standing there, I was bouncing around, waiting to see if the train was about to come. I got back to the bar at 1:45. Tanya, George, and Simon were already playing when I walked in. I as quickly as I could, got my guitar out and tuned it. Then I went to the stage and waited to see what I would be told to do. I listened to the band play Glenn Campbell's song Southern Nights with Simon and Tanya singing a duet. It sounded pretty good. Tanya had a nice voice and Simon had a decent bass. I didn't know the song very well, but I caught the tune quickly, and when they were about halfway through, I was able to join in. They all looked over at each other and nodded. When the song ended, Tanya went to get water bottles, and when she came back, she handed me a blue t-shirt that said, "Tanya and Crew." After handing out the water, Tanya began to tell me what she was expecting. She had decided what songs would be played at each performance and in what order. I looked at her list and found nothing I couldn't handle. Then she wanted me to sing Patsy Cline's True Love with her. It's always a little awkward singing a duet with someone you don't know. You're never sure what your singing partner is going to do. Sometimes they enter late or early. Someone holds a note longer than they should. Someone is singing at a faster or slower tempo than they should in the song. I found Tanya very easy to sing with. We blended and harmonized beautifully. A few moments after we started singing, I noticed that the other employees and the few customers turned to look at us. When we finished, despite the small number of audience members, we were applauded. "We'll definitely perform this song tonight," Tanya said as she leafed through her sheets. We performed about a dozen songs, and Tanya announced the end of rehearsal. George then told me to follow him into the kitchen, where he gave me a bartender's apron. "I'll be honest," I admitted with a shudder. "I know how to play guitar and sing, but I don't know anything about bartending." He laughed. "It's not rocket science. Tonight you'll just serve bottled or draft beer. If you have time, I'll show you how to mix a few simple drinks. You'll get the hang of it in no time. Just remember to be quick and smile. You'll get more tips that way." At 5 o'clock, more and more people began to flock to the bar, and I hopped back and forth serving bottles of beer or pouring drafts. I probably moved 30 cases of beer from the fridge to the bar that night. I also learned how to set up a new keg, sliced dozens of all kinds of fruit, and learned how to mix half a dozen drinks. I was already riddled with excitement when 8 o'clock came around and we headed toward the stage. However, when I looked around, Tanya was nowhere to be seen. I just shrugged and retuned my guitar. About 5 minutes later, Tanya appeared to applause. If my eyes hadn't been fixed, they would have fallen to the floor. Tanya wasn't wearing a blue t-shirt. She had changed into a blue and green sundress. The mystery of what remained made many of the men in the audience, I'm sure, drool. When I looked outside, the bar was only half full. But those who were there were already pretty well lubricated. I realized that this could be a good thing or a bad thing. People who are very relaxed about alcohol are easier to entertain. They also tend to buy more drinks. However, there is a fine line between a relaxed customer and an obnoxious drunk. Nevertheless, I was very excited to get the evening started. Tanya started the evening by singing Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, which immediately captivated the audience. We then moved on to a Johnny Cash song, followed by Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, and we all joined in. After about an hour and a half, Tanya told the crowd that we were taking a 15-minute break and would be back. Sitting in the kitchen, sipping water from a bottle, I felt more peaceful than I had at any time since my divorce. For the first time, I felt no pain in my heart. I hoped they wouldn't kick me out of the group after tonight. There were a lot of people, and Tanya was certainly the center of attention of all the men in the bar. She also had the attention of quite a few women. But as soon as we started the second half of our show, I realized something was wrong. There was a table with 2 women and 3 men near the stage, and I immediately realized that they felt no pain. In addition, they had gotten kind of loud and rude. They crossed the line from relaxed to obnoxious. Tanya was playing the second song when one of the men made a rude remark about Tanya's ass. But the remark was completely inappropriate. I could see that Tanya was starting to get angry, so I decided to intervene. I've handled drunks many times before. Drunks aren't usually bad people, they've just lost their restraint. The best way to handle them is through humor and mild embarrassment. So when Tanya finished her song, I snatched the microphone from her. Thank you, I said, as the light applause started to die down. Tanya looked at me with annoyance but didn't say anything. We really love it when people in the audience enjoy our shows. And this table here seems to enjoy the show more than anyone else. We want to show our appreciation to those we can call our superfans. I then turned to the audience. Would you like to meet one of our superfans tonight? The crowd started clapping and shouting, yes, yes, yes. I smiled and, of course, singled out the talker. I pointed to the boisterous gentleman and said, you, sir, seem to be having the best fun. Stand up and let everyone see you. The drunkard jumped to his feet, swayed a little, and said, screw you. Sorry, I don't sway like that, I said with a smile. Not that there's anything wrong with that if you prefer it that way. The crowd broke into laughter and started whistling. What's your name, sir? I asked quickly. Frank, he growled back. And I still say, screw you. Say, I don't know how long you've been dating Frank, but you're not going to win any woman's heart with that approach. Again, the crowd howled and laughed. Now, Frank, I said innocently, I can call you Frank, can I? Hell yeah. Boy, you have a one-sided mind, I said, laughing along with the crowd. So, Frank, you seem to have formed a strong opinion about one particular part of my friend's anatomy. I think it's only fair that you evaluate your anatomy as well. What do you think, friends? On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate Frank's ass? A roar of laughter was followed by the numbers. 4, 2, -10. I let the numbers continue for about 10 seconds before I announced, it looks like you rated that part of your anatomy very low. I hope there's nothing else like that on your body. I then looked at the ladies sitting at the table who were laughing just as hard as everyone else. Ladies, you know Frank. Does he have any other flaws? The 2 women nodded and laughed. Then one of them raised her thumb and index finger about an inch apart. This caused a storm of excitement in the house. Frank turned purple and ran out of the hall, hitting 2 tables in the process. When he finally went out the front door, the room was very quiet. I looked around and spread my hands in feigned confusion. Was it something I said? The hall went into a frenzy and I received a standing ovation. When I handed the microphone back to Tanya, she came over and kissed me on the cheek. She said into the microphone, my hero. That got another roar from the crowd. The rest of the show went very well, especially when Tanya and I sang True Love by Patsy Cline at the end. We got a standing ovation. I was nervous as we started to leave the stage. I knew the show had gone well, but I didn't know what to expect at this point. I overreacted by taking the microphone, but at that moment I felt like it was meant to be. George was the first to speak. This was our best show ever. He was immediately followed by Simon. Robbie, they ate out of your hands. Great job. And then I turned to Tanya because I knew she seemed to have the last word. She just walked over to me and gave me a big hug. I guess I was in. We weren't expected to man the bar after the show, but we helped the regulars and cleaned up. At this time, I found out that Simon is gay and lives with his boyfriend Dave. I was pleased that he wasn't offended by my drunken comments. He was actually quite amused to watch him squirm. George was single and a real womanizer. He had a girlfriend who waited for him to finish. If George hadn't made her show us her driver's license, I would have sworn she was no more than 15. I was shocked to find out she was 23. Lucky George. Tanya was very reserved. All I learned from her was that she'd been at Juilliard in New York for a year. Tanya didn't say anything about why she decided to drop out of school. All she said about her family was that her father abandoned them and her mother died. I also learned that Tanya was single and rarely went on dates. I didn't care. I was just happy that I could perform and get paid for it. The next night we had another gig and I thought the crowd was a little bigger, but I couldn't be sure. However, after the first performance, Carl took me aside and said he was impressed with the way I handled my drinking. The second night, I thought we had another great show, and Tanya and I sang 3 songs together. However, after that performance, Carl took me aside again and gave me some advice. Or maybe it was a warning. "Boy, you've got talent," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "But don't trust anyone in this business. Not Simon, not George, not Tanya, and certainly don't trust me." As the weeks went by, I could feel us starting to bond on stage. But off stage, while George and Simon were very friendly, Tanya was a very cold and aloof ice princess. It didn't bother me one bit as long as I could perform. For me, playing guitar and singing fed my soul, and getting paid was just a huge bonus. For the next 6 weeks, everything was the same. I worked at a bar and played music every weekend, and continued to look for work during the week. However, I have to admit that I didn't look too hard. I covered my expenses with money from gigs, tips, and the meager paycheck from working at the bar. And with each passing week, Susie became a more distant memory and the pain subsided. In my estimation, the crowd was getting bigger, but, again, I had no way to measure it. Even if that was true, Carl decided to make a change, and that Monday, he informed us that the upcoming weekend would be our last. He was bringing in a Beatles cover band for a 6-week contract. I was devastated. This meant that I would have to get serious about job hunting again. Carl proved that his advice was sound. I thought he liked our performance and appreciated it, but he really didn't care about us. Anyway, as soon as Carl lowered the boom on us, I went and bought a newspaper. I was looking through the classifieds when Tanya poked her head out from behind my shoulder. "What are you doing?" she asked with a smile. "As much as I regret my decision not to," I said, smirking back. "I never made a habit of only eating out once a week. I need to get a job. In fact, we all need to find a job to our liking." "Already taken care of," Tanya said, smirking, and walked away. "What?" said I, spinning around on my stool. "Have you found a job yet?" "No," she said with a token smile. "We've all found jobs." "No, you haven't." "Where? What kind of job?" replied I in utter confusion. "George! Simon!" shouted Tanya, entering the kitchen. "Come out here. There's something we need to discuss." Once Tanya had us all together, she led us to a table at the far end of the bar. George and Simon were as confused as I was, but they didn't say anything until everyone was seated. "Okay, Tanya," George finally asked. "What do we need to discuss?" "I've arranged for the next orders," Tanya said quietly. "Really?" George and Simon said at the same time. "Yes, to the Abbey Tree Lounge in Alpharetta for 4 weeks, and then to the Uptown Club in Cummings for 5 weeks. Then we're going to Charlotte, North Carolina. Brad Brooks and Honey Weston are doing 2 concerts at the Spectrum Center. They canceled performing at them, so we're filling in for them." "What's the pay?" asked Simon. "At Abbey's, we get $2,000 a week, but we have to perform 6 nights and 2 matinees, one on Saturday and one on Sunday. They also want us to cater the bar like we do here. At Uptown, they are going to pay us $200, the same rate as at Abbey. For 2 shows in Charlotte, we'll get $4,000 for 2 nights." "The Spectrum is a big venue," Simon said admiringly. "It seats at least 20,000 people." "How did you manage to organize all this from Saturday?" I couldn't help but ask. Tanya replied with the look of a Cheshire cat. "I've actually been working on it for a couple months. One agent came across our show and liked it. He contacted me when an opening came up at Spectrum. But I think if we do well in Charlotte, we might be on the right track." We all looked at each other with huge smiles. Then Tanya giggled. "I was going to tell Carl on Sunday, but he beat me to it. I didn't tell him anything because I figured if he thought we'd hit rock bottom, he might slip us something else." "Carl?" George hummed. "He'd steal his grandmother's eye teeth if he thought he could capitalize on them." "Before we start worrying," Simon said, throwing his hands up in the air, "how are we going to get to Alpharetta and Cummings? Marta doesn't go there. And even if we get to Charlotte, where are we going to stay? Rooms for 2 nights could eat up a big chunk of what we make?" Tanya looked at me questioningly. "Robbie, you said you have a car. What do you think?" I shrugged. "It's actually an SUV, but yeah, I can drive us if you guys spare some money for gas." "But Simon's right about Charlotte. If I was alone, I'd sleep in my car, but that won't work with the 4 of us." "That's already taken care of," Tanya said quickly. They rented a room for us for one night. I figured we'd arrive the day of the show, perform, and stay the night. After the second show, we would head back. The only downside is that it's only one room. And just so the three of you are clear, I get one of the beds. If there's only a double or a single, you'll all sleep on the floor. If there are two single beds, you guys can compete for the second one. Both events at Alpharetta and Cummings went well. The clientele at both venues was generous, and we made almost $1,000 a week in tips. At Cummings, after we sang True Love at the end of the show, a guy came up to us and said he would pay us $100 if we performed again. So we did. The spectacle was mind-blowing. None of us had ever performed in front of such a large audience. George and Simon were a little uneasy, but Tanya wasn't the least bit frightened. As for me, if you can survive farting in front of thousands of people, there's not much that scares you after that. Thankfully, we all pulled ourselves together. And by the end of our performance both nights, we had the crowd up out of their seats ready for the main entertainment of the evening. As we came out for our final bows on the second night, I looked over at Tanya. Her eyes were shining. It seemed to me that Tanya was chasing a dream. After the Spectrum performance, we all thought we were really moving up. However, the opposite happened. Things went downhill. We worked for a week or two, and then we did nothing for 2 or 3 weeks. It got really bleak, and I was tempted to go look for a regular job. But I didn't want to give up performing, and I didn't want to leave Tanya in the lurch. Just after New Year's Eve, George and Simon told Tanya they couldn't do it anymore. Simon got a job as a waiter, and George got a job as a carpenter on a construction site. All this time I worked with George and never knew he was a carpenter. Tanya was as depressed as could be. I have to admit that I didn't feel like a ray of sunshine either. I was a little better off than Tanya because I still had some of my bankroll that I had brought back from Tifton. But even with that, my funds were starting to dwindle at an alarming rate. I was about to throw in the towel when Tanya called me one morning and asked me to meet her at the Pancake House. She apparently had an idea on how to launch our music careers. I knew I should be looking for a job, but I just couldn't say no to Tanya. I guess even at that moment I was a little bit in love with her. But I never said or did anything to make myself known. I didn't want to get burned again, and I didn't want to ruin our musical relationship. The next day, I found Tanya sitting at her desk sipping a cup of coffee. I sank into the chair next to her and asked, "So, what's your new idea?" "He should be here in a few minutes," she replied, and then nodded toward the entrance to the restaurant. "There he is." Glancing toward the entrance, I saw a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard looking around. Seeing Tanya, he waved and headed in our direction. He looked to be in his early 50s and smiled affably. He was wearing a dark blue sport coat, gray slacks, and a white shirt. "Robbie, this is Alex Misner," Tanya introduced us. "He's a music agent. He spotted our gig and thinks he can help us out." Without making small talk, Mr. Misner began to discuss what we were up against. The music industry has changed a lot with the advent of the internet. For the most part, people are downloading the music they want. Gone are the days when you had to record a record and try to convince a radio station to put it on. Anyone can upload their music to the internet, so you have to create your own exposure, your own hype, your own brand. "Sounds great," I said. "But how do we accomplish that?" "That's what I'm doing for you," Alex said confidently. "The first thing we need to do is get you to play in as many different places as possible." "That's the problem," Tanya admitted. "We started getting bookings and even performed at the Spectrum in Charlotte, but then things stalled." "I heard about your gig at Spectrum, and that probably hurt you." "How can that be?" asked Tanya. "Well, from what I heard, you performed very well," Alex explained. "As a result, a lot of people booking gigs decided that you wanted too much money and crossed you off the list." "So you're saying we were penalized for performing well?" I asked incredulously. Alex nodded. "I think that's a fair assessment." "So what do we do now?" I asked, inwardly lamenting the unfairness of the system. "That's where I come to the rescue," the agent said, stirring his coffee. "I can book you a bunch of different places, but only for 1 or 2 nights, and then you'll go to a new place." Mr. Misner then looked at me. "Tanya tells me you write songs." "Yes, I do," I admitted. "But so does she. I have as many as 3 shoeboxes of them, but we've never used any of them in our shows." "Do you have anything related to children?" It could be babies, toddlers, teenagers, anything that has to do with children. I'm sure there is, I admitted. But some of the songs aren't very good. I have a couple too, Tanya cut in. But my songs are pretty rough too. Never mind. Try to polish your songs as best you can. We'll record the best of them. Then I want you both to analyze and pick 6 to 8 of the best songs on the same subject that have made other artists famous. I looked at Tanya and she seemed as confused as I was. Okay, we can do it, but what's the point? I have a friend who works for a parenting magazine. He's always looking for new ideas for articles. I pitched him the idea of having a group of singers record an album about children and he liked it. Now, if he likes the music, he'll write an article about the two of you. Alex Misner really knew his stuff, and I was thrilled. But the question that plagued me was, what does this guy want in return? That was the question Tanya asked. Sounds good, Alex, she said in her impassive voice. What do you get out of all this? I assume you're not working for free. He grinned. Tanya, no one works for free in this business. If you want my help, you'll have to sign a standard contract that makes me your exclusive agent. You can take it to any lawyer, but you'll find it's pretty similar to most contracts. Let me tell you about a few important points. First, I get 10% of what you earn. That's non-negotiable. But I don't get a penny unless I can find paid gigs for you. Second, the contract is for 5 years with an option to renew for another 5 years. Also, I have the final say on the outfits you wear, the music you play, and the name of the band. I'm sorry, but Tanya and the crew doesn't fit. Your new name will be Wind Dreamers. Tanya didn't like this at all and insisted on keeping the old name. Alex was adamant, and eventually, Tanya agreed. Tanya then spent 20 minutes reading the contract. With her intelligence and attention to detail, she could be a damn good lawyer. When Tanya finished studying the contract, she had no objections, but she did notice 2 spelling mistakes. Then we both signed it. The next 6 months passed like a blur. I found 6 songs in my box that weren't terrible. Alex especially liked 2 that I had written, Little Baby Love and Daddy's Little Helper. Tanya also found 2 songs he liked, Pretty Little Girl and Mommy's Angel. My other 2 songs were not memorized. I didn't care too much about my outfit. I wore tight leather pants, a fluffy white long-sleeved shirt, and a leather vest. Tanya's outfit, on the other hand, was hot. She wore a short leather skirt and a blouse with a deep neckline. Another change Alex made was the addition of a synthesizer to our room. Since George and Simon were gone, he needed more than just my acoustic guitar. Alex hired a few different guys to handle the synthesizer. However, the guy who performed with us the most was a young guy named John Tynan. We played every night and even matinees. We played every venue we could think of, from bars to college auditoriums to churches. I was interested in performing in churches because I was familiar with gospel music. Tanya hated performing there because the men would squint at her and the women would throw dagger looks. And this in a blouse that was cut much higher. I spent so much time traveling that one morning Mrs. Monroe stopped me as I was about to go to bed. Robbie, I'm worried about you, she said, with kind eyes radiating sympathy. You're on the move all the time, day and night. I don't think you're eating enough, and I know you're not getting enough sleep. Thanks for worrying about me, Mom, I teased her, kissing her cheek. But I'm doing fine. She slapped my arm. Go get some sleep and I'll make you something to eat when you get up. The article for the Baby Care magazine was a big hit, so Alex sent us into the studio to record an album. It took most of my reserve. Anyway, it was released online the same day the article was published. We combined the 4 songs I've already mentioned with 8 songs made famous by other people. The way it was set up, people could buy our album or individual songs online. Our online sales were just terrible. However, we sold our CDs pretty well at every show. We would buy CDs for $5 a piece, sell them for $12, and sell between 25 and 50 pieces a night. That amounted to $175 to $350 a night. All this time, Tanya and I were getting closer. We even started dating. I felt that Tanya was beyond me, but I still loved her. Nevertheless, Tanya kept telling me that I was the only one she really trusted and loved. I was the only one who supported her when things were at rock bottom. I was hopelessly in love with Tanya and devoted to her. After 2 months, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. It was Alex who came up with the idea to film our wedding and release it on DVD. I was very hesitant to do it, but Tanya was all for it. She thought it would give a big boost to our careers. I finally agreed, and it was decided that we would do it during a performance we had scheduled at a major church in the Atlanta area. I don't know how Alex convinced the church people to go along with his idea, but they agreed. Still, I was hoping it would be a relatively quiet wedding filled with music and love. I got 2 out of 3. The wedding, from my perspective, was filled with great music and tons of love. Quiet, however, the wedding was not. The local media got wind of it, and since the news cycle was slow, they swarmed the church in hordes. I didn't want to let the reporters inside, but Tanya and the church council changed my mind. Nevertheless, the church council set very strict rules that prevented the media from behaving in their usual boorish and arrogant way. Tanya and I discussed our wedding vows at length. In the end, we decided to sing the song made famous by Peter, Paul, and Mary, "This Is Love." It was Tanya who first suggested this song. I liked the idea, but I was surprised that Tanya chose it. The song has a very deep religious connotation, and I knew that Tanya was not religious at all. However, the song couldn't be better suited for a wedding. It is probably used in tens of thousands of marriages every year. I especially thought the last lines said everything about our love. For whenever 2 or more of you come together in His name. There is love, there is love. We sang this song just before the wedding ceremony, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. I noticed that even some members of the media had glazed eyes. After saying our vows, Tanya and I sang a song I had written especially for the occasion. "You are my one and only true love." When our voices fell silent, the congregation and our friends rose to their feet with a roar. It took almost 5 minutes for them to quiet down. Then we began the performance for which we were contracted. We changed our song list to include love songs and some more uplifting hymns. One part of the performance was special. I invited Monroe to my wedding, and they even sat in the same row as my parents. Mrs. Monroe loved Nat King Cole, and especially his song, "When I Fall in Love." I arranged to perform my version of that song for Mrs. Monroe. Thank goodness for synthesizers, because Nat had a whole orchestra behind him when he recorded his version. Before I started, I let everyone know that this song was for my other mom. I guess I didn't do too badly, because I could see tears streaming down Mrs. Monroe's cheeks as she huddled against her husband. Even Mr. Monroe's eyes clouded over. Yeah, my mom was crying too. My dad tried to pretend he had something in his eye. He did. They were tears. During the reception, I cornered Mr. and Mrs. Monroe and their sons. I told them I had left gifts in the garage for all of them. To Tabor and Tyrone, I gave the newest Apple cell phones. Years later, when I learned of Tabor's death, I was told that as he was dying, he clutched that phone in his hand. I gave Henry the best table saw I could find. He was always doing chores around the house. Henry told me he would buy a saw when he could afford it, and then he could really fix up the house. For Mabel, I bought an expensive Bose CD player and a complete collection of Nat King Cole CDs. She had just about worn out her record collection, playing them over and over again. After the reception, Tanya and I went on our honeymoon to Key West, Florida. It was the happiest week of my life up to that point. Sun, surf, and Tanya. On our honeymoon, we chose a place where there was no television or internet access. As a result, we had no idea that our wedding DVD was selling like hotcakes. 2 songs, "There Is Love" and "You Are My One and Only True Love," were released as singles and were climbing the charts. The song "There Is Love" reached number 32nd on the Billboard Hot 100, and "You Are My One and Only." True Love reached number 19 on the Country Top 100. Now we were starting to make money and never seemed to lack for bookings. We were even invited to perform at the Grand Ole Opry. After such an upswing, Alex decided that Tanya should be the face of our band. I totally agreed. She was much more interesting to look at than me. So I willingly let Alex do his thing. For the next 4.5 years, we did well. But Tanya still wasn't satisfied. She thought we should be so much better. I always divided musical talent into 3 categories. There were the A-list people and the groups that included the best of the best. I'm talking about people like Tim McGraw and Carrie Underwood. Or bands like the Statler Brothers or Charlie Daniels Band. These were the stars everyone knew and they had most of the big hits. Then there was the B-list with people or bands like Tanya and I who had a few hits but weren't big stars. And finally, everyone else. The vast majority of artists could never support themselves singing. Tanya and I had amazing success. I put us in the bottom half of the B group. Nevertheless, we were doing pretty well. We were often the opening act for some of the A-list artists. The fact that we had 2 minor hits was more than 99% of all performers ever achieved. We made about $5 grand every year. We weren't superstars, but we were known. We had our own fan base, and we performed at the Grand Ole Opry. Yet despite our good fortune, which was mostly due to Alex's planning and promotion, Tanya wanted to reach the very top. I loved Tanya's passion, but I knew we weren't good enough to make the A-list. What bothered me even more was that Tanya had completely fallen into the trap my grandfather had warned me about years ago. I wondered how she would handle it when Tanya finally realized that she would never be a superstar. Nevertheless, I trusted her and Alex that we would move forward, or should I say upward. However, things changed while I was visiting my parents in Tifton. Tanya and I had planned to go together, but she had a cold and didn't want me to catch it. So I went alone. I had planned to spend a week with my parents. That's when everything changed and the snake was allowed to crawl into our garden. Part 3. I met my wife when I joined her music group, Tanya and the Crew. Back then we were a cover band, performing mostly country and pop songs made famous by other people. Our music career was on the verge of collapse when music agent Alex Misner agreed to mentor us. Slowly, he began to build our act. After Tanya and I got married, we already had a decent reputation. We weren't superstars by any means, but we were making a hell of a lot of money. Married life with Tanya, at least to me, was wonderful. She seemed happy, and our personal life was on the up and up. However, I knew that Tanya was not satisfied with our careers. She was constantly pushing Alex to make things better for us. Tanya wanted better venues, better studio musicians, better recording contracts, more TV commercials. In short, Tanya was chasing the dream of becoming a superstar and was frustrated that we weren't achieving more. And I had to admit that it bothered me because every now and then Tanya would take her frustration out on me. It always hurt because I had worked harder than anyone else to make her dreams come true. At the time, I accepted that Tanya was like that. I think things changed a bit when Tanya wrote 2 new songs and we recorded them. They didn't go anywhere. Then I wrote a new song, which we recorded, and it had some good success. It went up to number 17 on the Country 100 chart. For some reason, Tanya snapped a little at anyone who mentioned the success of the song. This surprised me, since it was a solo written specifically for her. But this strange mood only lasted a week or so, and then Tanya was back to normal. After returning from a short 4-city tour, I decided we needed a break. I talked Tanya into coming with me to Tifton to visit my parents. Not having parents of her own, Tanya had always felt a little awkward around mine. So I was surprised and happy when she agreed to come with me to my hometown. I didn't mind visiting there myself since I only occasionally managed to spend a day with my mom and dad. Sometimes they would come to Atlanta for a few days, but we were usually very busy during the day, so we only got to see them in the evenings. I guess I was a little homesick because it had been years since I had spent any real time in Tifton with my parents and the rest of the family. And of course, none of us were getting any younger. When I told my parents about our plans, my mother insisted on throwing a party in honor of my relatives. Most of them had only met Tanya at our wedding. It was supposed to be a small party at my parents' house. However, it quickly grew to several hundred people and my parents had to rent a community center. I was frustrated with my mother's ever-expanding party, but Tanya told me to let her have her fun. However, the day before we were supposed to go, Tanya came down with a cold. Instead of canceling the trip, Tanya insisted that I go on my own. Before we left, I checked Tanya's temperature. It was holding at 101. After assuring her that she would be fine, I headed south. Of course, my parents were very disappointed that my wife couldn't make it, but they were happy to see me nonetheless. During the week, I visited most of my relatives. I also met up with many of my high school buddies. And every night I called Tanya to see how she was doing. By Thursday, she seemed to be feeling better, but her voice was completely shot down. The big party was scheduled for Saturday, and I wasn't particularly looking forward to it. It was what my mom wanted, after all, and I wanted her to be happy. Anyway, on the way to the party, my mom told me that it would be nice if I sang a few songs. I kind of expected it, but pretended to grudgingly agree. But as soon as we pulled into the parking lot, she stunned me with her next statement. "Oh, Robbie," my mom said, as the car came to a stop, "I just want to let you know that I've invited Susie and George Menard." "What?" I almost choked. "Why the hell would you invite my ex-wife and her hubby?" Mom only smirked and said, "Spite." Seeing the crowd relaxed me, because I figured I'd never see them among hundreds of people. Besides, I had a lot of my relatives and a bunch of my friends hanging around me. Still, the hope that I wouldn't run into my ex-wife was not realized. About a half hour after arriving, I turned around and came face to face with Susie and George. Susie looked like she had put on at least 20 pounds of weight, and the dress she was wearing made her look like 10 pounds of potatoes stuffed into a 5-pound sack. George looked like a 70-year-old man, and I knew he was only 50. "Robbie," Susie's eyes lit up, "how are you doing?" The devil on my shoulder was shoving dozens of nasty things in one ear, but the angel upstairs was telling me to behave, in the other ear. The angel won, mostly because I figured my mom would get annoyed with me if I let my temper get the best of me. "I'm doing great, thanks," I said with a fake smile. "How are you guys doing?" "We're doing great too," Susie continued to cheer. "George has 4 car dealerships now. He's even more successful than when I married him." "That's great," I said, desperate to be away from those two. When nothing obvious happened, and Susie continued to tell me how great she was doing, the devil took over. "Hey, I want to thank you guys." "Thank us," said George, looking at me incredulously and suspiciously. "Why would you want to thank us?" "Well, George," I said with a broad smile, "if you hadn't stolen my wife, I never would have moved out of Tifton. I would never have found the fine career I have now. Instead, I'd be sitting in our old house watching Susie get fat. Have a good time." With those words, I turned and headed to the other end of the hall. I glanced at my mom to see if she had heard anything of this conversation. However, as I passed my mom, I noticed that she was trying to hide her amusement behind her hands. When I looked back, I saw Susie, flushed with anger, reprimanding her husband. The party was actually very enjoyable. I learned that all of Mom's sisters and their friends had organized the party. And when the final count was taken, 414 people showed up. I know this because most of the party was paid for by me. There was no way I would have let my parents pay for such a big party. The day before I was supposed to go back to Atlanta, I got a call from Tanya. Alex had had a heart attack. That was the beginning of the end for Tanya and me. I got back to Atlanta in record time, and thankfully, I learned that Alex would make a full recovery. But he was very concerned and voiced his concern the first day he returned to his office. For him, the heart attack was a wake-up call. Alex decided it would be best if he retired. He would work until we found someone else, and then let us terminate his remaining contract with him. This was extremely generous, considering that there were 3 years left on his contract, and he really didn't need to do anything during that time except get his 10%. But Alex was exactly the kind of person he was. Tanya and Alex did all the initial interviews with potential new managers. When it came down to 2 candidates, I was brought in for the final interview. Todd Wilton was a good-looking guy in his early 40s. He had successfully managed several well-known bands. Sonia Hilliker, on the other hand, was a 33-year-old blonde with an impressive resume, but had only led small groups. However, every group she managed to go from 0 to some significance. Todd, on the other hand, managed to keep his groups on the same level. I was fine with either option. However, I considered Sonia the best of the two because she managed to increase the popularity of her bands. In contrast, Todd, although he managed his bands well, was not able to develop them much. However, I wasn't surprised that Tanya favored Todd. I realized very quickly that my wife didn't care for Sonia at all. I should have fought for my choice, but at that moment it seemed unwise to take a manager who would immediately antagonize Tanya. Besides, I was happy with either option. In the end, Todd was hired. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was a total jerk. For the first 6 months, I didn't notice anything different. Then I started to get the feeling that something was wrong. Tanya started spending more time with Todd, supposedly discussing finances or schedules with him. Then Todd started scheduling personal appearances for me and Tanya separately. He explained that by splitting up, we would be able to cover more ground. It seemed reasonable, though I wasn't happy with it. My world had turned to shit right after the last concert of the last tour, and I was completely dumbfounded by what had happened. I was especially happy that the tour was over, and Tanya and I were able to have some alone time. We were the opening act for the Down Home Boys. They went on tour after they recorded their third #1 hit. We played 8 of their 10 shows, and they seemed to be very happy with us. And today, I had just finished writing 2 new songs that I thought were pretty good, and I was looking forward to going back to Atlanta to record them. I wasn't going to tell Tanya about these songs because I wanted to surprise her. Her birthday was only a couple weeks away. However, after one night, I told her about them anyway. Tanya got excited and wanted to see the songs right away, so I got them. Tanya was thrilled. By this time in our careers, Tanya and I had probably moved into the middle of the B group. I was hoping that my 2 new songs would move us up a little more. I knew that Tanya was becoming less and less enamored with me as the opening act. She wanted to be the sole attraction. However, I knew the chances of that happening were slim, but I thought my 2 new songs would move us a little closer to that possibility. Lord knows Todd hadn't come up with anything new to help us. In fact, I checked the schedule for the next year and it was pretty sparse. I remember wondering at the time why Tanya thought Todd was doing such a good job. Of course, I was a gullible fool, and that turned out to bite me in the ass. It was Monday morning, and at 10 a.m. we were flying out of LaGuardia Airport back to Atlanta. Tanya's suitcases were already down in the lobby, and I was waiting for someone to come get mine. Tanya said she wanted to get something from one of the stores and would meet me at the airport. I told her we were getting close and there was no need to delay. I was just sitting on the bed waiting when a gentleman in a light gray suit appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Robbie Wilder?" he asked. I nodded. He handed me an envelope and said, "You have been served." I was totally confused and asked, "What are you talking about?" But the man had already left. I looked at the envelope in my hand with bated breath, and when I opened it, my world came crashing down. Tanya had filed for divorce against me. I sat on the bed for a long time, stunned, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Finally, I was brought out of my trance by the bellboy. While the young man gathered my things, I began to read the papers. Tanya was divorcing me, citing mental cruelty and physical abuse. That accusation was a damn lie, and the red-hot anger that swept over me overpowered the feeling of despair. I'd never raised a hand or a voice against Tanya. Why would she make such an outrageous accusation? Right now, however, my only thought was to confront her and ask her why. Reading on, I was stunned to learn that she had claimed most of our assets. I kept telling myself that this had to be a terrible mistake. I had to talk to Tanya and figure it all out. But my call to her phone instilled an icy fear in my heart. Her phone was no longer working. And then it hit me, and everything fell into place. Todd. All those late nights, the coldness, a couple snide remarks, Todd's smirks when he thought I couldn't see. In that moment, incandescent anger turned to white-hot rage. But then, just as quickly as that feeling, I sank back into a sea of despair. I dropped the divorce papers on the floor and was about to drop the envelope when I realized there was still something in it. Shaking out the second piece of paper, I found another legal document, a restraining order. It stated that I had to stay 500 feet away from Tanya. I also had to stay 500 feet away from our house and studio if Tanya was going to be there. My heart was completely broken. I couldn't understand anything. Tanya and I had made love the night before, and it had been passionate. Surely she hadn't fallen out of love with me in one day. Suddenly I was struck by lightning. Maybe she had never loved me at all. My head spun and my stomach churned, ready to rebel. I don't think I had anything close to rational thought at that moment. When the feeling of nausea overwhelmed me, I rushed to the bathroom. When my stomach finally emptied and calmed down a bit, I walked over to the window. Looking at all the people rushing around below, I envied each of those thousands of people because they weren't me. If I had been able to open the window, I would have even considered jumping. I felt like my whole reason to live was gone. I don't know how long I stood like that, but suddenly I wanted something to drink. My attention instantly turned to the minibar, and I treated myself to one of those mini bottles of scotch. By the third bottle, my mind had clouded and the pain wasn't as acute. Despite the clouding of my judgment, The alcohol calmed me down and allowed me to start thinking about the current situation. Still, no matter which way you looked at it, I was completely screwed. I needed to do something, but I had no idea what. The only thing that kept me going was the desire to completely destroy Tanya and Todd. But then I remembered how Susie had abandoned me, and how powerless I'd been then. And it looked like there was nothing I could do about my traitors again. I grabbed another bottle of scotch and gathered up the papers. I almost ripped them to shreds, but instead I started reading further. And it got worse. All of our joint assets were frozen until the court decided on the final division. Then I found one last insult that made the rage rush back into my alcohol-fogged brain. My first-class ticket to Atlanta had been canceled. It was replaced with an economy-class ticket 2 days later. It was all so cold and hateful. In that moment, I was overwhelmed with pure white hatred for Tanya and Todd. I wanted to destroy them. I swore to myself that I would in some way avenge the utter disrespect and contempt with which they had treated me, even if it took the rest of my life. But at the moment, I couldn't think of anything I could do to get back at them. I just couldn't get my head around the fact that Tanya had betrayed not only our marriage, but also our business partnership. It wasn't enough, but Tanya and Todd were trying to completely destroy my music career. If they were able to back up these allegations of abuse, I was in deep shit. This was especially true for the woke generation. The mantra in those days was that a woman should be believed. She should be believed whether there was evidence or not. A cold chill ran through me as I suddenly realized how dire my situation was. It was obvious that if I didn't do something soon, they would run a steamroller over me and I would be nothing but a grease spot on the pavement. My first decision was to go online and check our checking accounts, personal and work. As the court documents said, the accounts were marked up. I had no idea how much money should be in the business account, but I knew it should be significantly more than it was. As for our personal account, I knew it was seriously depleted. I had withdrawn money from an ATM last night, and I still had a receipt that showed the balance was almost 3 times what it was today. After 2 unsuccessful attempts to get through on the phone because my brain was impaired by alcohol, I finally got through to the front desk. I asked them to hold Tanya's luggage for a bit. I would be there shortly to make arrangements for him. As for my luggage, I asked them to bring it back up because I would be staying 2 more nights. I then sat back down and began to look over the papers in detail. I poured the remaining scotch in the small bottle into the sink. At this point, my anger overpowered my self-pity. In the weeks to come, these 2 emotions would take turns prevailing. But, in the moment, I was beyond furious. If I wanted to protect myself, I needed a clear head to plan what to do next. I reread everything twice and was still outraged. I put the papers aside and decided to take care of Tanya's luggage first. I arranged for it to be placed in offline storage. I paid for it with a personal credit card that I don't think Tanya knew about. It was a small thing, but I wasn't about to let Tanya know where her stuff was. Then I called our attorney, Greg Pinder. It was another shock. Greg told me that he had been hired by Tanya and there was nothing he could do for me. I was furious and lashed out at Greg. "Send it. Of course you know that means I'll never use you again and we're no longer friends," I said irritably. "Robbie, I'm going to let that remark pass my ears because I know you're really upset right now." "You think I'm upset, Greg?" I asked with cold fury. "You have no idea. You were my parents' attorney before you were mine. I was the one who brought you in as our business attorney. And when you decided you wanted to be an entertainment lawyer, I referred clients to you. You knew all this shit was going on, and you let Tanya stab me in the back without saying a word. You should have stayed out of it and referred Tanya and I to different lawyers. But instead, you took sides. That was a bad decision on your part because I will no longer refer anyone to you and will generally advise anyone who asks that you can't be trusted." "Are you threatening me?" said Greg with some anger. "No, I'm telling you to back off, you piece of shit." I slammed the phone down. I didn't know if I could hurt Greg's training or not, but I was definitely going to try. I knew he had about a dozen show business clients, and I had sent 7 of them to him. I also figured that by putting the word out to 3 or 4 of them, they would start looking for a new lawyer. While I was heatedly discussing Greg's betrayal, it dawned on me that he probably wasn't the only one who knew what was going on. I thought back to the people in the studio. They might not have known what Tanya and Todd were up to, but they must have known that Tanya was cheating on me. But Greg and all the other assholes were the least of my problems. This day was getting worse and worse, and I had to try to stop the bleeding. When my whole world turned to shit, I headed to the minibar. But instead of alcohol, I got a soft drink. I needed to get my thoughts together to plan my revenge. And then a thought struck me. I suddenly realized that the company would be responsible for the room until I checked out. If I couldn't get money from the company, I would make them pay for my snacks and drinks, so I called the front desk and asked them to restock the minibar. I was in a lot of pain, and as much as I tried to understand, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. If Tanya wanted to be with Todd, all she had to do was tell me she wanted a divorce. I would have been crushed, but not like this. This was more than just a divorce. There was something else at play here, but at that moment I didn't know exactly what it was. However, I had no doubt in my mind that this was all Todd's idea. I really wanted to believe that Tanya didn't really know what was going on, but that didn't make any sense. I had to admit that none of this could have started without Tanya's willingness to go along with it. For the next 2 hours, I just lay there feeling sorry for myself. I cried a fair amount. Why do women feel they have to treat me like shit? And I've put up with it my whole life. I could never really get back at any woman who turned her back on me. Now Tanya was not only leaving me, but she was planning to leave my career in smoking ruins. From the wreckage of my career, Tanya was going to make herself bigger and better than before. Hatred and anger overwhelmed me until I finally exploded, screaming, "I can't take it anymore." I tried to reason with myself. First of all, Tanya and Todd had waited until the end of the tour. I was sure it was to make sure there was no possibility of breaking the contract, but I didn't understand why they were trying to trap me in New York. Perhaps they were going to try to get their hands on all the assets before I returned to Atlanta. But what good would that do? In the divorce, the company's books would be examined, and everything would be split 50-50. Maybe Tanya would want to claim the house. I didn't care, let her have it. Maybe they were trying to make me feel financially desperate so they could approach me with some ridiculous offer. They must have realized that no matter what they offered, given what they did, I wouldn't agree to it, even if I had to sleep on the street. None of this made any sense. However, the more I thought about the fact that they were trying to squeeze me into a financial box, the more I recognized that it made some sense. But if that was their plan, they had miscalculated badly. I was sure they knew nothing about my personal accounts. Since our partnership was actually a limited liability corporation, our tax accountant insisted that each of us receive a paycheck. This was done so that the IRS would leave us alone. We each received a salary of $6,000 a month. I, after deducting whatever was required, had almost $4,500 a month going into my brokerage account. Both Tanya and I performed in person, and we were paid directly. Tanya spent most of her money on clothes, jewelry, and art supplies. I instead invested all that money in my broker. That's the way I was raised. All told, I now had almost $800,000 in my personal account. Not only did I have an ATM card, but I could call and have the money sent to me directly. And although the royalties from my songs had gone down in recent years, they were still bringing in $15,000 to $20,000 a year. And the royalties from those songs were mine. Todd tried to talk me into turning the songs over to the corporation, but I flatly refused. In the back of my mind, I had planned to give the songs to Tanya for our 10th anniversary. Now that's definitely not going to happen. Even though I had booked a room for 2 more days, I was still thinking about flying back to Atlanta that night. But I decided not to, because there was nothing waiting for me there. Instead, I decided to call our old agent Alex and discuss the mess Tanya and Todd had made for me. "Hi," I heard Alex's familiar voice. "Alex, it's me, Robbie." I tried to cheer up. "Robbie, it's good to hear from you. How are things with you and Tanya?" "Terrible," I replied. "And that's why I'm calling. Tanya has filed for divorce, citing mental and physical abuse as the reason. She and Todd have also put a restraining order and injunction on me. They are attempting to cut me off from any company assets and cut off any conversations between me and Tanya. They have also brought in Greg Pinder, so now I am in a cove without a paddle. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." "If Greg did agree to represent Tanya, then he has a serious conflict of interest," Alex said firmly. "But we can talk about that later." "I have plans for Greg in the future," Robbie offered. "But I agree. Right now he's a minor annoyance." Alex was silent for a few long seconds, then sighed. I'm sorry, Robbie. I should have said something when you and Tanya decided to get married. I knew you were crazy about her, but I also knew she didn't have the same feelings for you. Tanya told me that she really liked you, but she didn't want to get married. Then I made the mistake of casually mentioning that a wedding could generate huge publicity. Tanya immediately jumped on the idea. That's when I realized that while she cares about you, Tanya cares much more about her career. She's the worst kind of publicity whore. I think she would sell her soul to be a superstar. Hearing Alex's words drove me even deeper into myself. Thinking back on my relationship with Tanya, I realized that I was much more in love with her than she was with me. In fact, I now doubted that everything about my marriage was a lie. Robbie, I know this isn't easy for you right now, Alex said soothingly, but I'll help you in any way I can. From what you're telling me, your marriage is dead. So what do you want to do now? The growing pain swept over me. I was completely surprised by the words that came out of my mouth. I want to burn that bitch. She destroyed what was most important to me. I want to destroy what's important to her. A long pause hung on the other end of the line. Then Alex sighed. I don't know what that means, but I strongly suggest you just walk away from her. Let the lawyers handle the divorce and the liquidation of the business. You're talented enough to start a career on your own. Don't let this harden you. It's too late to stop it, Alex, I admitted, because I was beyond bitter and desperately wanted to set Tanya's ass on fire. I knew that Tanya's greatest desire was to become a superstar, but at the moment, I had no idea how to keep her from it. The odds were that it wasn't going to work out for her, no matter what Todd had planned. But I wasn't okay with that. I had to stop her from becoming a star somehow. It was a way to get back at Tanya. And if Tanya failed, she'd turn on Todd. That would be fun to watch. Okay, he said with a sigh. I'm not exactly sure what exactly you want to do to get back at Tanya. But right now, let's start with the basics. I'm going to give you the number of the lawyer who's going to handle your divorce. He's a real shark. And I'll give you the number of the corporate attorney who'll fight for your business rights. If you don't have the money, I'll pay your fee. No, that's okay. I have enough money of my own. Wait a minute, Robbie, Alex said suddenly. There's something on the news about Tanya. I waited by the phone for a long 2 minutes before Alex picked up again. Todd just announced your divorce, citing physical and mental abuse. He also announced that Tanya is starting a solo career. They are going to record a new album with new songs. Todd also announced that they are planning a new tour for Tanya. They haven't wasted any time, have they? Said I with despair. Then a horrible feeling in my stomach came over me. Suddenly I whispered, "My songs." I dropped my phone and began frantically searching through my luggage for shoeboxes of my songs. I finally breathed a sigh of relief when I found them, but that feeling evaporated when I picked up the boxes. I realized they were empty. Tanya had stolen my songs. Suddenly I remembered that Alex was still on the line. Alex, are you still here? Yes, he replied with confusion in his voice. What's going on? Tanya stole my songs, I said with desperation in my voice. That makes sense now, Alex replied. Todd is an asshole, of course, but he's smart. They left you in New York so they could go back to Atlanta to record their new album. And as far as I can tell, Todd and Tanya are going to try to control the course of events. They'll try to generate sympathy and make you look like a misogynist or something worse. I can get PR people to help you with that. Just remember to tell your side of the story every time you talk to the media. Categorically deny the abuse allegations and tell everyone how they are trying to steal your part of the company. I know things are looking very bleak right now, Robbie, but don't get discouraged. I'll make sure you can fight back. As I hung up the phone, I felt like a man again, not the eunuch Tanya was trying to turn me into. I gathered all the papers and sorted through them so I could speak intelligently with the two lawyers. By the time I called them, Alex had already informed them to expect my call. I faxed the legal documents and arranged for the fees to be deposited into their accounts. Now I had nothing to do and was stuck in New York for 2 full days and part of a third. To add to that, I hate New York. It's a dirty, smelly city filled with disgusting people. Most of the New Yorkers I've met are rude, arrogant, and abrupt. Why anyone would want to live here is a mystery to me. With nothing to do and feeling the walls closing in around me, I had to find something to keep me sane. If I stayed in the room, I would start thinking about Tanya and start hitting the minibar again. Instead, I went for a walk. I figured I'd walk for a while and then go to some show. Anything to take my mind off my misery. The walk was actually pleasant. It was a beautiful spring day, and the heavy rains of the night before had cleared the air and cleaned up the city to some extent. The temperature was in the neighborhood of 60, and despite the New Yorkers, I was enjoying myself. The first thing I did was go to the ATM and withdraw another $600. New York is very expensive, and I knew I wouldn't have enough money to last long, even with what I had withdrawn yesterday and today. The only place in Manhattan I knew was Central Park, so I decided to head there. I wanted to be away from the frenzied flow of people rushing to who knows where. I stopped at the top of the stairs going down into the park, at one of the entrances. At the side of the stairs, a young woman of about 25 was playing guitar and singing. She was wearing a worn sundress and loose blonde hair. She had a pretty face, but she seemed a little thin. There was an open guitar case in front of her in case anyone wanted to drop a donation in there. Judging by the money that was in there, if she relied on it, no wonder she was so thin. I was intrigued because the woman could barely play the guitar, but she had a beautiful voice. I studied her bare arms, looking for drug injection marks, but found none. The more I watched, the more intrigued I became. Finally, I reached in and pulled out my wallet. I pulled out $100 and motioned to her. "How do you do?" I asked the young woman politely. Her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Fine," she mumbled. "Tell you what," I said with a smile. "I'll give you $100 if you let me play guitar while you sing." "I'm not doing anything weird," she said angrily. "Look, I know it's goddamn New York where everyone's weird, but this is a direct offer. $100 if you let me play guitar while you sing. Of course, I might sing a little myself." The young woman looked at me intently, and then at the $100. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head. The girl was desperate to get the $100, but she wondered what else I wanted. "Look, just to make sure I'm okay," I said to allay her worst fears, "I'm going to put $200 in your briefcase right now and come over here. If you want to make a deal, have someone hand me the guitar. I bet the guitar didn't cost you more than $50. If you don't want a deal, I'll take the $200 and leave." I tossed the $200 into the case and walked away. After about 30 seconds of deliberation, the girl finally asked the teenager to hand me her guitar. I took it and started tuning it. It was old and pretty beat up, so it took a few minutes to get any sort of decent sound. I looked at the girl and asked her what her name was. "Dawn," she replied quietly. "Well, Dawn, my name is Robbie. What songs do you know?" She named about a dozen, and I knew them all. After thinking for a few seconds, I decided we'd start with Amazing Grace. That song touches 90% of the people who hear it. I wasn't sure about New Yorkers, but it would be great if it only touched 50%. We got off to a bit of a rough start. I had never performed with Dawn, and she certainly wasn't a professional. But quickly we came into harmony, and with Dawn's crystal-clear voice and the power I could generate, we began to draw a crowd. Donations started coming in. The crowd continued to grow until we had about 30 or 40 people gathered around us. After about an hour and a half, I saw her looking at her watch. "I have to go," Dawn suddenly announced, jumping to her feet. "What's the rush?" I asked. "People are just starting to come out for lunch. I need to get back to New Jersey to pick up my daughter." This was certainly a good reason to cut our impromptu concert short. I was a little disappointed because I was really enjoying myself. So, reluctantly, I handed the guitar back. Dawn tried to put it in the case, but it wouldn't close with all the money. By my calculations, with the $200 I'd thrown in, she should have had about $400. Unfortunately, most of it was in coins. Dawn raked out the coins and spread them into her pockets and purse. Unfortunately, she was now ringing like a reindeer. "How are you getting home?" I asked, following her out onto the sidewalk. "I'll take the bus from the harbor and transfer when I get to New Jersey." "Look, I can't let you do that," I said. "It wouldn't be safe. You sound like a goddamn piggy bank." "I can't afford to drive any other way," she said, speeding up, apparently trying to leave me behind. "Wait a minute," I said, whistling for a cab. "I'll pay your cab fare." "I told you I don't do weird shit," she said with anger in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, opening the cab door and stepping back. "Just tell the driver where you want to go." The cabbie immediately barked out that he was going to New Jersey. Typical New Yorker. "How much will it cost?" I asked, trying to sound more pushy than he did. He thought for a second and replied, $70. How about 100? I said, handing him 5 20s. Then I turned to Dawn. I'm only in town for tomorrow. I'm flying out the day after tomorrow. If you want to play again, meet me here at 10 in the morning. If you can't make it, that's okay too. But if you come, I think you'll do even better than today. As I stared after the departing cab, an idea of how to get back at Tanya popped into my brain. I'd go back to her tomorrow if Dawn showed up. End of part 1. Part 2. Maybe coming out in 10 hours. Write in the comments if you're waiting for it. Also, give a like under this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video.